In the summer of 1943, the vast Russian plains were heavy with morning fog. The short grass of the steppe trembled imperceptibly under the weight of tank tracks, and the air was filled with the smell of damp earth and hot oil. On the gray horizon, columns of smoke rose from camps and training grounds. The weak sun rose from behind them, casting a cold light on the metal of the armor and on the tired foreheads of the soldiers. Preparations were underway for a huge offensive. The operational plan, codenamed Citadel, directed a vast array of forces towards a defensive ridge around the city of Kursk. From the north and south, lines of heavy and medium tanks were forming in an endless parade. The Tigers and Panzers, with their heavy turrets and irregular armor lines, along with the lighter armadas and support vehicles, formed a combination of iron and fire. Crews worked at the machines. The engines made a deep, steady roar. The tools gleamed in the cold, polished light, and the soldiers leafed through maps with oily hands. On the other side of the square, the Soviet Red Army was strengthening its defenses. The square had become a network of trenches, anti-tank ditches, dense minefields, and artillery positions. The roads were blocked by iron barriers and barbed wire ditches, and every stream and ravine served as a defensive ring. Hundreds of thousands of men, heavy artillery, and machine guns waited behind embankments and earthen walls. In the days leading up to the operation, warehouses were filled with ammunition and spare parts for thousands of armored vehicles were prepared. Command headquarters were constantly processing information. The bases on the maps were covered with symbols full of numbers and arrows, and every tactical decision was made amidst cigarette smoke and the buzz of busy telephones. Communication lines, codes, and messaging were active, but what mattered on the ground was the tangible preparation of man and machine. Logistics workers were working late pulling carts, mechanics repairing damaged engines, and infantrymen practicing defense in the trenches. With the beginning of July, the troops moved in a heavy silence, the silence that precedes a storm. Armored columns streamed down the roads toward the starting points of the advance, kicking up dust and clouding the sky with diesel fumes. From afar, the sound of huge engines and the clatter of chains sounded like the strains of a war drum. Reconnaissance flights were continuous. Planes were ascending, transmitting ground images to the command so that the latest data could be checked before the main blow. The Kursk terrain, underfoot and under armor, became a field on which a huge mass of war equipment was concentrated. Mines were densely planted, artillery batteries were deployed on the hills, and anti-tank units were located in villages and cemeteries. The sides of this prepared field were designed not as simple lines, but as a complex network of intertwined defenses. Every step was costly to the attacker, and every mistake could decide the fate of a battalion. That summer, more than 3 million soldiers and thousands of tanks and artillery had massed in the region, an impact that would forever mark the human and physical landscape of the plains. The time had come for the great test, the onslaught of iron and fire that would change the nature of the Eastern Front or shape what remained of it forever. The Kursk plains, calm and vast, were now the scene of a great battle, one that would shake the earth of history in the coming days.
The dawn of July 5th was colder than usual, and a thick fog hung like a curtain over the Kursk plain. The soft Russian soil was still wet from the night before, and it bore the marks of tank tracks in dark, continuous lines. In the heavy silence, the only sound was the distant rumble of engines, a regular metallic rhythm that grew louder every moment. The Germans were preparing to launch Operation Citadel, the attack that would crush the Kursk salient and once again turn the tide of the war in the Third Reich's favor. The first cannonballs cracked the silent sky. The ground shook under the soldiers' feet. The waves of explosions fell on dusty faces, and black smoke spread the smell of hot metal and gunpowder into the air. Hundreds of German artillery pieces aimed at the Soviet frontline positions with machine-like precision. Hills, embankments, and ditches were lost in successive explosions. Moments later, the ranks of Tiger and Panther tanks moved forward, iron lines stretching to the horizon. The turrets slowly rotated, the long barrels of the guns were lost in the fog, and the earth trembled under the weight of the armor. On the other side, the Soviet defense was already awake. Counterfire erupted from trenches and hidden positions towards the advancing tanks. Each anti-tank shell roared through the fog and sank between the armored columns. The first Tigers caught fire, tall flames rose in the smoke, and the turrets were torn off with a deafening explosion. But the movement did not stop. The following ranks advanced without stopping, stepping over the wreckage and crushing the soft earth under their sand. The sky was filled with attack aircraft. At low altitude, the Stuka squadrons dived with their sirens blaring in terror. The bombs landed near the Soviet defenses, sending up a wave of dust and fire. But the sky was not without resistance. The Soviet anti-aircraft guns responded quickly. White and black flames burst into the sky, and several planes crashed in black smoke and bright fire. The sky and the earth merged. The boundary between above and below was lost, and everything was burning and trembling in smoke. In the middle of the plain, the tanks of both sides met at close range. Anti-tank shells were fired at close range, and each impact was followed by a furious explosion. The ground was covered in shrapnel and smoke, and the infantry moved between the half-destroyed trenches to hold the lines. Soviet artillery came into action from behind the second lines. The ground shook again under the pounding of thousands of heavy shells. Although many of the guns had been destroyed in the first attack, the meticulous organization of the Red Army quickly filled the gaps. During the day, the faint summer sun broke through the fog, turning the black smoke into a light gray. The Kursk plain was a sea of scorched metal and scorched earth. Tank wreckage lay everywhere, wheels and tracks torn from the hulls, and half-burnt shells were buried in the ground. The Germans were still advancing, despite heavy losses, but every meter of ground was expensive. To the south, Army Group Center was slowly advancing towards Oberon. To the north, the Voronezh Corps was putting up stubborn resistance. Until dusk, the battle continued without a clear victory. The sun sank behind the bloody fog, and the shadows of half-burnt tanks stretched across the ground. No one knew what would happen tomorrow. Only the sound of the engines, still roaring, showed that this battle had just begun. A battle that was to decide the fate of the East on the Kursk plain.
On the second day of the battle, the air was warmer and the sky brighter, but the land no longer smelled of life. Black smoke from burning still rose from countless points, and the sound of half-dead engines mingled with distant screams. The Kursk plain had now become its true face, a place between heaven and hell, where every hill, every valley, and every embankment was littered with broken machines and silent bodies. The Germans tried with all their might to break through the Soviet defenses on the southern axis. New columns of Panther tanks, fresh from the production lines, entered the field. These tanks were supposed to be the symbol of the Reich's industrial superiority, faster, stronger, more deadly. But in the sticky Russian soil, many of them broke down before reaching the front lines. The engines overheated, the chains sank into the mud, and some even went out in their own smoke before the first shot. In the Soviet defensive lines, the Red Army held out with unprecedented discipline. Each position, after being destroyed, was replaced by a new layer. From behind fresh embankments, artillery sent a wave of fire at the attackers. Every German tank that advanced was immediately hit by several direct shots. The ground trembled from the blows, and a heavy dust settled over the plain. In this dust haze, enemy and friend were sometimes lost, and the battle continued blindly at short distances. Soviet reconnaissance planes flew at low altitude and recorded enemy positions. The data was quickly transmitted to the artillery. The Soviet long-range artillery, with precise calculations, rained down a barrage of heavy shells on the moving German columns. The ground rippled with waves of explosions, and each time, a line of smoke and fire was drawn on the horizon. In some places, the tanks came so close together that the cannons were useless, and the battle came down to direct contact of steel with steel. At these distances,
Bullets touched armor, and flames burst from the seams of the hull. In the north, the situation was different. The Germans were pushing south from the Ural region, but the minefield and constant defensive fire slowed their advance. Thousands of anti-tank mines were hidden in the ground, and each explosion dislodged a tank. The sound of explosions rang out like a ceaseless bell across the plain. Many tanks lost their wheels in the explosions and became lifeless obstacles in their path. On the second night, amid the fire that rose from the burning tanks to the sky, the sound of battle did not subside. The artillery was still firing, new positions were being dug, and both sides were trying to draw a new line. The light of the explosions lit up the sky moment by moment. From above, if one looked, the Kursk plain was like a map of fire and smoke, bright spots of explosions moving in the darkness and then fading. By the end of the second day, neither side had the upper hand. The only difference was the terrain, which was saturated with blood. But the Germans still had hope. Their commanders believed that the next day, with the final advance, the Soviet defenses in the south would be broken. No one knew that the Kursk plain, contrary to plans, would not surrender to any army.
By the third day, the Kursk plain had become a graveyard of steel and ash. The smoke was so thick that the sun was barely visible through the fog. In the brief silence between attacks, only the sound of burning hot armor and the clanking of expanding metal could be heard. The smell of oil, gunpowder, and blood-soaked soil filled the air. There was no breeze to disperse the stench of death. On the southern axis, the German 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hutt launched a new offensive. Columns of panzers emerged in meticulous order from the smoke, while overhead, Stukas dived with a whistle and dropped their bombs on the Soviet positions. The ground erupted with explosions, and trees were blown up. Soviet tanks waited in half-concealed trenches until the enemy got close enough. As the clang of chains echoed through the earth, the first bullets burst through the smoke. The thick armor of the Panthers could not withstand it, and fire rammed through the ranks of moving tanks. On the northern front, General Model's troops tried to break through the Soviet defense ring in the Ural area. But the Soviet artillery, with its precise concentration, had turned the lines into an inferno of fire. Every advance of a few hundred meters cost dozens of tanks and hundreds of casualties. There were whispers among the German officers that perhaps they had underestimated the enemy this time. Perhaps the Soviet defenses were, contrary to expectations, endless. On every embankment, there were men ready to fire their last bullet and then stay there. Behind the lines, Soviet supply trains were moving at night. Thousands of artillery shells, fuel, and supplies were flowing toward Kursk from across the Soviet Union. Russian planes in the night sky turned off their lights and flew silently so as not to be detected by enemy radars. On the ground, wounded soldiers were being carried from the battlefield, some with their eyes still open and staring into space. Under the flickering light of the lamps, military doctors with hands covered in dirt and blood patched up half-dead bodies. At dawn on the fourth day, when the fog lifted from the plain, the two armies were lined up a short distance apart. The sound of tank chains rose like a continuous groan from the earth. On the horizon, the shadow of smoke and fire still hung in the sky. The birds had left the area. Only tanks and men remained. Both sides, exhausted but determined, knew that retreat was no longer possible. The land of Kursk was to be swallowed up to the last breath without allowing victory to escape its mouth. That morning, a heavy silence fell over the plain. Then, in an instant, hundreds of cannons roared. The ground shook, the sky darkened again, and the Battle of Kursk entered what would later be known as the Battle of Steel on Steel, the greatest armored battle in human history.
On the fifth day of the battle, Kursk was no longer a city or a plain, but a living, merciless creature, breathing with every explosion and feeding on every scream. The ground was filled with fire and iron. The tanks that had marched majestically yesterday were now sunk into the earth like burnt and disintegrated animals. The sky had no water or sun, only a layer of smoke and ash that mixed day and night. On the southern front, the Germans were advancing with what remained of their strength. The officers had tired, sleepless eyes. The maps were no longer meaningful because the Soviet defenses were intertwined and any point could be a field of death. The newly arrived Panther tanks roared heavily through the muddy terrain, but Soviet anti-tank rounds came out of bushes and ditches and pierced their armor. Some tanks were in flames before they even reached the battlefield. The dirt trembled under the wheels, but every step had a price. At that very moment, in the Soviet headquarters behind the front, General Rokossovsky was looking at the maps with cold eyes. The red and blue lines on the maps were no longer fixed. They changed every hour. He knew that the Germans would run out of breath sooner or later, but before that, thousands more would have to be sacrificed. The younger commanders asked him anxiously if it was time to counterattack. Rokossovsky simply said, "Let the enemy advance to the last drop of his gasoline. When he stops, the ground will speak for itself." And the ground did speak. A sudden summer rain began. Mud rose in the fields, and the German heavy tanks got stuck in it. Chains slipped, engines whined and shut down. From the hills ahead, the roar of Soviet artillery rose. Bullets rained down on the enemy's tightly packed ranks with deadly regularity. Within an hour, the sky was covered in fire. The explosions were so continuous that there was no longer any difference between the sound of death and silence. In the midst of this hell, the infantrymen advanced in the shadow of smoke. Bodies lay silently in puddles of water. No one looked back. Every step forward meant surviving another day. They did not know what city awaited them beyond this plain, but they knew that if they sat back, everything would collapse. As night fell, the rain stopped. A thick fog covered the ground. In the distance, in the deadly silence, only the sound of half-dead tank engines and the howling of the wind through the steel wreckage could be heard. In that darkness, the only thing that sparkled was the reflection of the fire on the burnt armor. Kursk was not over yet, but the earth knew that this night was the last calm before a greater storm.
It was not yet light when the first artillery shells rang out east of Kursk. The horizon, before sunrise, was red, not with dawn, but with the flames of war. This time, it was the Soviets who started the fire. After weeks of defense, the moment had come for the counterattack. From behind the scorched forests, thousands of cannons, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers fired simultaneously. The ground shook. The explosions continued until even birds fell from the sky. A wave of fire and smoke swept toward the German positions, where their soldiers were left in shallow trenches, stunned and defenseless. The narrator in history's mind, with heavy silence, recounts that this was the moment when the fate of the Battle of Kursk was decided. Each cannonball was not just an explosion in the ground, but a gash in the pride of the Third Reich's war machine. Soviet T-34 tanks emerged in long lines from the morning mist. Their hulls were covered in mud, their turrets black with soot, their red flags half burned in the heavy summer wind. Amidst the dust, commanders showed the way with colorful flags, silent, determined, as if they knew that this was the moment history was coming back. The German lines were in chaos. Radios screamed from the excessive interference. Commanders could not find each other. The Tiger tanks, the steel giants of the Wehrmacht, were stuck in the mud and fire. Some of them had their turrets torn off their hulls by direct hits. Others, silent and motionless, showed only the reflection of fire on their shiny armor. What had once been a symbol of German engineering superiority
now lay dying like defeated monsters amidst the smoke and dust. Behind the front, in the small towns around Kursk, people were still in their bunkers. Women and children listened in fear to the constant sound of explosions. The ground shook and the walls cracked. In the basement, an old woman, with trembling hands, twisted an old rosary between her fingers and prayed silently, not for victory, but for survival. Outside the city, thousands of fresh soldiers lined the supply lines. Trucks were constantly coming and going. The smell of fuel, sweat, blood, and dirt was all mixed together. By noon, the sky was no longer recognizable. The blackness of the smoke had become so thick that it swallowed up the day. The sun was visible as a red, faded shadow in the dust. From the air, Soviet squadrons took off. Yag fighters and light bombers swooped in at low altitude. From afar, in the German commander's cameras, the earth looked like an ocean of flames. Each bomb left a black stain on the plain, and between the explosions, there was only a brief, deadly silence. In the midst of this hell, a lone soldier walked through the ruins. His weapon was muddy and heavy, his clothes were torn, his face was covered in dirt. He looked neither forward nor backwards. It was as if the whole world was confined to a point between his breaths. Around him, scenes of silent death could be seen, an overturned tank, half-burned bodies, and the flag still standing in the fire. At that moment, the meaning of victory or defeat had vanished from his mind. Only survival remained. At dusk that day, the sound of the artillery died down. Only a heavy fog remained on the plain. Through the fog, the sound of tank tracks could be heard. Quiet, heavy, continuous. The Red Army, tired but victorious, was advancing towards new positions. Behind them lay scorched earth, ruined villages, and endless smoke. But in the eyes of the soldiers, something new had formed. Not pride, but a profound understanding of the price of victory. They knew that history was written on this plain in the ink of blood and soil. That night, a strange silence reigned in the Soviet headquarters. Maps were spread out on the table. Red lines were drawn to the west. The generals divided their gaze between the map and the window. The sound of the wind shook the metal windows. In the distance, the sky was still burning. In the command office, a quiet sentence was whispered through weariness. The German summer is over. And history, with its quiet but heavy echo, recorded it.
The next morning, the Kursk plain seemed calmer than ever, but this calm was nothing more than a thin veil over the devastation. The sun was rising above the horizon, its lifeless light falling on the broken bodies of the tanks. Smoke was still rising from the burnt steel hulls. The birds had not returned. The air was full of the smell of fuel, blood, and hot metal. The plain, like an endless cemetery, had fallen into a heavy silence. The narrator, without speaking, narrates with the eye of history. In the center of this plain, where the day before had been an inferno of fire, now only the remains of war remained. The giant Wehrmacht tanks, the same machines that had once symbolized the power of Nazi Germany, now stood motionless, buried in the mud. Beside them, Soviet T-34 tanks, with bent armor and broken turrets, sat quietly. There was no sign of victory or defeat, only the cost of war and the land, which no longer knew anyone. In the camps further back, Soviet soldiers were collecting bodies amidst the smoke and dust. The sound of shovels digging into the earth mingled with the clatter of tank tracks as they passed in the distance. No one spoke. Sometimes a faint explosion came from beneath the earth, mines still breathing.
The young men who had returned from battle had eyes devoid of the glow of life. Their gazes were fixed on the ground, and in their every movement the weight of something invisible was felt, something more than fatigue, something like the final realization of the futility of war. In the distance, smoke still rose from a half-burnt village. Women, black cloths on their heads, walked through the ruins. A child was searching through the rubble for a piece of metal or dry bread. Nothing remained of the houses, only half-burnt walls, window frames without glass, and a silence that overshadowed everything. One of the women, with wounded hands, pulled out a piece of military uniform from the dirt and kissed it. No one asked whose it was, because the answer no longer mattered. That same day, at Soviet headquarters, General Rokossovsky sent a report to Moscow. In it, only a few sentences were written. The enemy has stopped. Our lines are held. The land is free. But what was hidden behind these cold words, with thousands of lives lost, thousands of dreams crushed under the chains of tanks? A few kilometers away, among the ruins of a German trench, a burned notebook was found. Only a few lines remained. We no longer know why we are fighting. The earth is swallowing everything. Perhaps we are fighting only to stay alive. That sentence, in a bitter way, told the fate of all the soldiers on both sides. When night fell, it began to rain. Drops fell on the hot earth and steam rose from the ground. The sound of thunder had replaced the explosions. From the sky, a dark canopy spread over the plain, and only scattered flames of burning gasoline remained in the corners of the field. Among those flames, shadows moved slowly, men who were still alive, but something inside them had died. Kursk, after days of fighting, fell silent. But this silence was not peace. It was only the silence of the earth that now buried history in itself. And what remained were not tanks, nor armies, nor flags, but the memory of the smell of fuel and dirt, and the rain that could never wash the blood from the face of the earth.
In the days after the battle, Kursk no longer resembled a battlefield, but an open wound on the earth. Black smoke could still be seen from the sky, and lines of ash, like dried veins, covered the plain. There was no sound of a bird, no sign of life. Only the wind, quietly swirling among the wreckage of tanks, made a muffled sound of rusted chains. This was where history had been written in the dirt, not with a pen, but with fire. In the days that followed, Red Army engineering teams entered the area. Their mission was not to fight, but to clear. Mines were scattered everywhere. Every step could have been the last. Men with tired faces slowly dug the ground. Sometimes there would be a faint sound, a short explosion, and then silence. No one stopped. Death was no longer new news to them, but rather a companion in their daily work. The Kursk plain now smelled strangely, a mixture of burnt metal, rain-soaked soil, and something approaching death. Along the ruined roads, trucks with nameless bodies were moving. License plates were being collected, but most of them were illegible. The war had also burned away identity. In the empty trenches, notebooks with half-burnt notes, family photos, and half-expended bullets could still be found, relics of people who no longer existed. In the city of Kursk, life was slowly returning. The half-ruined walls still bore the scars of the rubble. People with silent faces were rebuilding their houses. No one spoke of victory, because everyone knew that no one had really won this battle. An old man in the town square was digging the earth with a rusty shovel. "The earth will remember all this," he muttered. His voice was lost in the wind, but history seemed to hear it. At the same time, in Berlin, the Wehrmacht commanders were gathering their plans. The Kursk operation had been the greatest German armored defeat to that day. Hopes of a comeback on the Eastern Front had vanished. The Reich factories were still producing tanks, but nothing could replace all that experience and faith that had been lost. In the officers' eyes, a shadow of reality had formed, a reality that said their empire was coming to an end. Months later, when the first snow of winter fell on the Kursk plain, everything turned white. The ground, as if trying to hide its wounds. Burnt tanks were buried under the snow, and only rusty turrets protruded from the white layer. The snow quietly covered everything, but not the sounds. Under every inch of this soil, there were screams buried, screams that remained in the silence of the earth for years. Kursk was no longer just a battle. It had become a symbol of the ultimate limit of human resistance, not for glory, but for survival. The men who fought there were no longer heroes or enemies. They were just men in the midst of the whirlwind of history. And the earth, engulfing them all, stood silent witness. Years later, when the survivors of the war returned, a cold wind blew across the plain. They stood in silence, looking at the ground, and only a whisper could be heard. "This is where the world burned, to be reborn."
In the spring after the battle, the Kursk plain had not yet calmed down. Blood-soaked mud covered the ground, and under every crater were the remains of armor and bones. The wind still howled among the charred remains of tanks, and the rustling of twisted and decaying metal was heard like a whisper from the past. The soldiers who had come to visit would sometimes pause and stare at the ground, as if trying to make sense of something that had happened years ago. The main roads were covered in ash and gravel, and the trees that had experienced the fire of war were still half burned and bent. Amidst the ruins, a group of Red Army engineers was busy rebuilding communication routes and clearing mines. Every step they took was fraught with danger. Every small explosion a reminder of those bitter days. The mines were still waiting for the unsuspecting touch of humans, as if they kept the memory of the violence of the war alive. In the surrounding cities, life was slowly returning, but the shadow of war still hung heavy. The half-ruined houses were gradually being repaired, and people with tired and listless faces returned to their daily lives. There was no real celebration or joy, just a return to daily life with the memory of memories that no one could erase. The markets were slowly opening, but the sound of laughter was rare. Mostly silence and thoughtful glances filled the air. On the outskirts of the city, temporary graves of soldiers had been created. Families came, sometimes with tearful faces, sometimes with trembling hands, but no memorial stones were complete, only simple sticks with names carved in pencil or pen. The dirt that was poured on these graves smelled of both death and life, and the survivors, in deep silence, faced this contradiction. Alongside all this, the memories of the commanders continued to flow in secret meetings. The notebooks and maps left from the battle showed the defeats and wrong decisions. This information was later used in military training to remind us that no army can conquer history solely by the power of armor and artillery. Any mistake could cost thousands of lives. Finally, the Kursk plain came to an artificial calm. Winter snow covered the ground again, hiding the scorched scene. But beneath the whiteness, the memories and effects of the war were still alive. Every breeze that crossed the plain carried, in a way, silent stories and buried screams, stories that were never fully told, but never forgotten. This plain was now not only a witness to battle, but a keeper of human memory.
a place where men stood against history and recorded their scars in the earth, so that future generations would know what price war had paid.
The spring of the year after the battle, a thick morning fog had settled over the plain. The crooked hills and deep craters left by past explosions cast a heavy shadow on the ground. The surviving soldiers and army engineers were busy clearing mines and rebuilding the ruined roads, their every move accompanied by caution and fear, for every step could be their last. The rustling of rotting metal and charred tree trunks still echoed in the wind, a reminder of the bloody days gone by. In the nearby towns, people with weary and sad faces were trying to rebuild their lives. The half-ruined houses were slowly being repaired and the markets were slowly reopening. But silence and exhaustion prevailed, and there was no real celebration or joy. Children who had survived the war played in the streets filled with dirt and gravel, but their gazes were still filled with fear and trepidation. Every corner of the city was a reminder of victims and destruction, and the memory of war never faded. On the outskirts of the city, temporary graves of soldiers had been formed. Families came there slowly and respectfully, sometimes shedding tears, sometimes speaking silently to the earth and the names of their loved ones. Simple sticks marked with names and dates were a reminder that behind each name there was a story of pain and loss. The fresh soil that was poured on these graves smelt of death and life together, forcing the survivors to reflect. Army commanders and leaders continued to review past decisions and mistakes in secret meetings. The surviving battle plans and notebooks were a testament to the complexity and brutality of war. These documents were later used in military training to teach future generations that every decision on the battlefield could put thousands of lives at risk and that no strategy is without consequences. The Kursk plain had, over time, regained its apparent calm. Winter snow covered the scorched and devastated ground, hiding the scene of past violence, but beneath the whiteness, scars and memories remained. The cold breezes that swept through the ditches and hills seemed to carry the screams and silent stories of thousands of people. Stories that were never fully told, but never forgotten. The plain was now not only a witness to war, but also a keeper of human memories and experiences. A place where humans stood against history, and with every breath and every step were reminded of their sacrifices and defeats, so that future generations would understand the price of war and how they could learn from it.
The land, which had been the scene of violence and explosions days before, now seemed calmer than ever, but the smell of gunpowder and scorched earth still lingered in the air. The half-destroyed houses, cracked walls, and collapsed roofs were reminders of the days when fire and blood took the breaths of people and soldiers. Amidst these ruins, the few remaining soldiers, in khaki clothes and with tired faces, moved with slow and cautious steps. They searched the land, looking for remaining weapons or perhaps the hope of finding something to preserve humanity in all this devastation. The cold wind passed through the ruined buildings, and its howling sound recalled a mixture of anger and loneliness, as if the land itself had kept the memories of every explosion and every scream in its chest. The soldiers advanced, step by step, each rustling of dry leaves or the movement of stones on the path making them more cautious. In one corner, a child in torn clothes and a dusty face emerged from the rubble, his eyes filled with fear and confusion, but still with a spark of life. On their way, they reached the central square of the city, where the battlefield, once bustling and noisy, had now turned into a silence filled with memories. The remains of burnt tanks and cars, the walls riddled with holes, and the traces of bullets all testified to the intensity of the past battles. The soldiers stood on the remains of a half-destroyed building and looked around, their eyes filled with pain and fatigue, but at the same time, a light of hope and victory shone in their eyes. They paused for a moment to catch their breath, drowning in the memories of the war and those lost, and at the same time thinking about the future. A gentle breeze blew from the east, and the chirping of birds gently broke the heavy silence, a reminder of a life that could return again. Every step they took carried with them the weight of the past, but the next step was a step towards rebuilding and continuing life. The soldiers gradually moved away from the field, through the ruins and empty streets, and in every glance they held an image of patience, resistance, and humanity. The old and wounded city still retained its soul, and with each passing day, it transmitted its memories to those who had survived to tell the story. In this silence, after the storm, life was sprouting again, and hope, though fragile yet powerful, shone amidst the ashes of war.